Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. Okay, so first of all, this is I'm trying some new things here. So I've got Eric Hernandez with me in person. We're doing a debate, CC Exchange 23, with Justin Schieber. He and Justin Schieber are debating God's existence. That's why he's here in person. He also just kind of lives not too far away. But I can't believe this is like the first time that we're actually like doing any kind of work together. But let me say this. So this is kind of new for me, having we've actually got two camera angles. Let me show you. Look at that, just beautiful close-up shot. Look at that. Just look at that face. Just look at that face. I actually watched that video that you did on your debate with Skylar. We'll maybe talk about that a little bit later. Sure. But I watched that again recently. It's just very entertaining. Yeah, very entertaining.
That's the way to put it.
Well, anyway, so yeah, the what I was saying at the very beginning of this, by the way, the topic today, we're talking about AI, consciousness, dualism, God's existence, Christianity, some of the debates that Eric Hernandez has done. So a lot of cool different things that we're going to be talking about today. But I did want to mention that this is a little bit new. So if something goes awry or whack, then just blame me. Like I'm switching things on my phone. Like I touch a button, switches to a different camera angle. Pretty cool stuff. And I can't see any comments either. My computer's too far away, so I can't read any of the live chat that's going on right now. Anyways, all right, with that out of the way. So again, we're talking about AI, consciousness, dualism, the soul, how this all relates maybe to God and Christianity. So Eric, but first just start out, because this is your first time that you've actually been on the show. Just start out by a brief introduction about who you are.
Yeah, my name is Eric Hernandez. I'm the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. And that encompasses everything from going and speaking at churches to organizing what we call the Unapologetic Evangelism Conferences. We do 3 all over the state of Texas with one of our affiliated churches, and being able to engage with cool channels like yours.
Sorry, I'm trying to make it a little bit cooler in here. It is getting pretty hot, and my phone stopped working there. Okay, there we go. We're good now. So, yeah, I remember I was a breakout speaker, right, at one of the conferences a few years ago.
With Moreland, actually.
Yeah, with Moreland was there, and I was able to ask him a question like in the Q&A period. That was really cool. Yeah, so you've done a lot of debates, and what would you say? We're kind of not getting directly on the topic yet. Maybe you guys can just stick around. This is gonna be a fun conversation. So, what is like one of your most memorable debates that you've had?
Probably my first official one-on-one public debate. To give a little bit of my backstory, those who've seen my channel or know what I do may have heard it, but essentially my freshman year of college, I took my first philosophy class. I loved it, even though I later found out my professor was an atheist, but because I was allowed to ask questions, and I didn't always get that at my church, I'll put it that way. And wanted to take another class in philosophy. Everybody warned me not to take Professor Pena's class because he's antagonistic towards Christianity and religion, and his goal is going to be to make me lose my faith. But that kind of intrigued me, and so I'm like, well, where can I sign up? Because, call me crazy, but I knew if Christianity is true, I needed to know why. But if it was false, I'd still like to know why, and maybe this was the guy for the job. And long story short, it's because of this philosopher that I got into, really dove into philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of mind. I don't know if you've heard me talk about that before, but essentially he gives this argument. He pulls out this antidepressant pill from his pocket, and he says religion wants us to believe in something like a soul, but and because of the soul we can have hope in an afterlife and seeing our family and friends that have passed away before us. And according to Christianity, your thoughts, emotions, beliefs, sensations are all supposed to reside within this immaterial soul, and these are also supposed to be immaterial. But the problem is, if I took this pill, it has the power to change and affect the alleged immaterial states of my soul. And how can that be? How can something tiny and physical have the power to affect the immaterial? And essentially he argued that every time scientists have looked at the brain or the body, all they find are physical stuff. So how do we explain that if there is a soul? And he said, well, the answer is simple. The answer is there is no soul, there is no God, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no afterlife. You're just a physical brain and body, and we need to learn to live with this fact, get on with our lives, and stop believing in these fanciful, foolish fairy tales. And it was almost like class dismissed. What troubled me was that for the first time in my life, I heard an argument that, if true, would prove Christianity false. The reason I say that, and without unpacking all the details, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, if there is no resurrection, Christianity is false, and he even says people should feel sorry for us for how gullible and dumb we are for believing this. That's the Eric James version. And suffice it to say, again, without going into the details, for the Pharisees, which Jesus would have adhered to, Paul was a Pharisee, their eschatology involved what John Cooper calls a two-step eschatology: intermediate state and resurrection. And because yes, we're getting a physical body, but it's also me that is being resurrected with the physical body. But if there's no soul, how can there in principle be that kind of a resurrection? And if there's no resurrection, well then how could Christianity be true by the same token that Paul's arguing? So I could ignore it or brush it under the rug, and I'm not the kind to just sweep things under the rug. So to make a short story long, after I had graduated from that and got my bachelor's in theology, this school, I remained good friends with the chairman of that philosophy department, and who was my first philosophy professor. And we'd talk every now and then, and they would do these roundtable discussions every semester with the philosophy department, and you got extra credit if you went. And I remember the first time I went, that was the first time I heard of and saw Professor Pena. And again, the next semester I had to be taking his class, and I noticed that. So there were 4 people on this panel. It was a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Christian, and then an atheist. And they would ask a question like, what role does religion play in our society, or should it play? And the first person to answer was a Christian, then it went down the line, and the last was the atheist. And the Christian said something like, well, I'm a retired 40-year missionary, and we've built wells, and we've gone and fed children, yada, yada, yada. Then when it got to Pena, the atheist, he said, well, first of all, I don't think religion should play any role, and if you're going to go with what she said, well, then you're not even doing it for the right reasons. I'm an atheist, and I do those things, and I don't have those motivations, so, kind of appealing to be more virtuous and whatnot. And suffice to say that every question was that way. Christian would answer, he would kind of make her look silly. Well, going back to after I graduated from this community college, the chairman actually contacts me and says, hey, we want to do another roundtable on religion. Would you be interested in representing the Christian side? And I was like, sure, yeah. I was at that point already into apologetics and whatnot. And I said, out of curiosity, who's going to be on the panel? And sure enough, Pena was one of them. So it starts, and I'd say within 10 minutes of it starting, the first interruption happened, and that's when I was giving like my, not opening, but it was just kind of informal. He interrupts me, and from that point on, it was pretty much he and I going back and forth for the rest of the time. The students loved it. The chairman loved it. We did that 1 or 2 more times. All this time this was happening.
I assume none of this was recorded?
Gosh, I think it was. I don't know where it would be on YouTube. I think I didn't record it. Someone did, and they put it on their channel, but they may have deleted the channel since then. But all those, it was once a semester, and then I got to do this, at U of H, did it at San Jacinto, did it a few other places. And there was a youth pastor who would attend these, who kind of like had a relationship with the school, who do stuff. And he came up to me, not knowing my connection with Pena, said, hey, I notice every time you guys do this, it's always you and him going back and forth. Would you be willing to debate him one-on-one on God's existence at my church? And I was like, yeah, sure. So, we both said yes. So what's interesting is that I remember leading up to that, let's say like 2 weeks before the debate, he calls me and he kind of starts to apologize. And he says, I'm really excited about this, but the church doesn't think people are going to show up to this. So they were going to put you in the sanctuary, but instead they're going to put you in the gym. Hope you're not offended. I'm like, I've never done this one-on-one, so, I'm good with whatever. Day of the debate, I get there about an hour early, to kind of get settled in, study, pray, and whatnot. And again, he meets me at the door and starts apologizing again and says something like, they only gave us 200 chairs. They don't think a lot of people are going to show up, but if we need more chairs, we can. Hopefully you're not offended. I said, don't worry about it. About 15, 20 minutes before it starts, I'm in the back room. I kind of peeked my head out just to see who showed up. Well, those 200 chairs were full. They pulled out 200 more chairs. Those were full. And there were people standing along the back and the side of the church, and people were still walking in. And that night, including online, there was about 600 people who watched that. And that night, there were more atheists than Christians at church because how influential this professor was. So, yeah, again, to make a short story long, that had to be my most memorable because aside from it being my first, I think the impact that it made was just pretty profound.
Well, it also kind of makes sense of like your interest in the arguments for the soul, right? That's kind of like, that was the first person who actually challenged you on
That's
that.
right.
It made you see that maybe there is actually like a connection between that and Christianity. And then, so that actually is interesting and insightful into like why you've focused on that.
Yeah. And you know, what's kind of funny / sad too, I'll tell it this way. Sometime after our debate, I went up to him and I said, I know you're an atheist, so I don't know how you're going to take this, but I just really want to thank you for allowing God to use you the way he did in my life, because if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. And he kind of just, you know, smirked and whatever. But what's sad to me is that what got me into apologetics wasn't being inspired by some Christian or some pastor or some youth pastor. It was because of 2 atheist philosophy professors. I think that's sad, because even if God wanted to use a Christian to push me in this direction, he couldn't, because there were none in my life who did it. I didn't know what apologetics or philosophy was. In fact, I intentionally took a class in philosophy because I thought philosophy was just sharing your opinion and making stuff up, and I was good at both of those. So I'm like, I could skip this class, you know, and still pass. But again, fell in love with it, and you know, I'm reminded of what Christ said, that if you don't cry out to me, these rocks will. So to me, these 2 atheist philosophy professors were rocks God used to cry out in my life, because no other Christian would.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I don't know if I've said something similar to my brother, because he's the one, his journey into atheism was the impetus for me starting my journey into apologetics. So I don't know if I've said anything like that to him, but I definitely should thank him for playing his part in God's plan.
Right, yeah.
Okay, well, why don't we turn now to the topic of the video, and then we're just going to hit a bunch of different things. As I said, I think I mentioned that at the beginning of the stream. There's a bunch of different things we're going to talk about today, but let's get into the topic of AI and consciousness. So one thing that I've been doing with respect to AI is I've been using it for thumbnails lately. So I've been using it to create, one of them in particular was, now I can't remember who I interviewed, but the thumbnail was Rose Fawn. So Rose Fawn and the Problem of Evil. It's like a very famous example that this atheist philosopher William Rowe uses, this fawn who dies in a forest fire. And it just seems like a very paradigmatic case of pointless suffering. And so what I did is I had AI create an image of a deer in a forest fire, basically, and made it look really, really nice and everything. That's really the extent of my knowledge of AI, other than using ChatGPT for various little things here and there. But I mean, this is like a huge topic now. Everyone is talking about AI, especially with the recent advancements of things like Midjourney for image creation, and then ChatGPT, and then so it's becoming more and more on the forefront of the minds of the culture right now. So, and one question that's being asked so often is, are these AI, artificial intelligence, is ever going to get to the point where they obtain consciousness? I mean, that alone is an interesting question, right? But then there's the question of like, what are the implications of that? Some people think if they do obtain consciousness, then do they have rights? And what does that look like? And then another question would be, more specifically in the religion arena, would be something like, if we can create consciousness, then what does that say about like God? Does that mean that like it doesn't seem that difficult actually to create consciousness? And so some people have actually used arguments from consciousness for the existence of God. And even this book that I've got right here from Josh Rasmussen, he's got some arguments in here that you can't basically build consciousness out of physical materials. There's these like construction problems that you face. And so if it does occur though, it's happened to create consciousness, what does that mean for these different arguments for God? And then there's a whole lot of implications, but let's start back at square one. As someone who has, you've spent years studying dualism and consciousness, and so what are your thoughts on AI and consciousness? Do you think that AI is ever going to get to that point?
No, I would think it's metaphysically impossible. But aside, like a preliminary remark, so if you and I, growing up, we're about the same age. When we got into apologetics, like the Kalam was like the thing to go to, and it's still a great argument. But what you now notice is that nowadays atheists are familiar with the Kalam, right? Because like back then you'd use a Kalam, maybe they weren't familiar with it. But now
it depends on what you mean by familiar.
Fair enough, yeah. They've heard it
They've
before.
heard it.
Put it, yeah, right. Put it that way.
Let me also make a caveat. I'm not saying that like all atheists are just completely ignoramuses, but I am saying that a lot
That
of online
most of them are.
most of them are. No, but a lot of them just haven't done the deep work and the deep study on these arguments.
But like when the Kalam was first out there, of course everything starts in the academic, then kind of trickles down. It takes some time, but it made a pretty big impact, and I think it still does. But now people are more, given that they've heard it before, they now have kind of responses to it. So it almost kind of lost that. For some people, it kind of lost that newness to it, that punch. I think, and I hope too, but I think the existence of consciousness is now going to be the next kind of Kalam impact. So I would recommend to any young aspiring apologist, get some consciousness understanding, philosophy of mind, under your belt, because I think that's going to have huge impacts, and I would love to see arguments from consciousness be as widespread as a Kalam.
I think that is super, super good. I mean, I'll pull up this book one more time. So you guys probably can't really see it that well. We're kind of far back here, and then there's a glare on it and everything. The book is called Who Are You Really? By Joshua Rasmussen, the subtitle, A Philosopher's Inquiry into the Nature and Origin of Persons. And so what Josh Rasmussen did recently is as a professional philosopher, he did a deep dive into consciousness, and he wanted to really ask the question, what are we made of, and what are we, and he's appealed to consciousness, and he's well known, I would say probably the most well known philosopher right now, working on arguments from contingency. And so he's got a lot of great books. One of them, it would take me probably too long to find it on the bookshelf. It's called How Reason Can Lead to God. And in that book, he develops an argument from contingency, but then he also appeals to different data that get it together. What is that?
My spinner.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I like to fidget.
Sorry, you got me distracted. So he appeals to no. He appeals to consciousness at some point in that book as some sort of like at least a reason to think that if there is a foundation of reality, then it's got to account for consciousness somehow. And so how do you do that? One of the ways is you just give it consciousness, and so consciousness can come out of consciousness. So anyways, but yeah, I just to kind of go back to what you were saying, like new apologists, if they're wanting to get into the apologetic scene and really champion an argument, then I 100% agree that consciousness is a great area to go into.
Yeah, and consciousness, soul, whatnot, all falls under philosophy of mind. So can AI be conscious? So lots of things to say. One thing is that I think that one of the first things
because earlier you said that it's metaphysically
impossible, right? So to kind of as some groundwork, I would first say that consciousness is not identical or reducible to the physical. Because when we look at anything, we first want to ask, what's the nature of a thing? So what's the nature of consciousness? And if we take theism and naturalism as our two live options, then right off the bat, it would seem that consciousness fits more on a theistic point of view, given that at fundamental reality, you have an unembodied mind. In a discussion I had with David Smalley, it was actually the second one, like when he asked me if I thought there could be minds without brains, I'm like, of course I do. And he was so shocked.
Remind me to come back to those discussions that you've had with him.
Oh, yeah,
I'd
sure.
Love to talk about this.
He was so shocked. Oh my gosh, you can believe there's a mind without a brain? I'm like, you realize I'm a Christian. How is that shocking to you? When at the core of Christianity, there's an unembodied mind. So
God.
Yes, right, exactly, God. So what is consciousness? And suffice it to say that when you look at the features of consciousness, and there's various arguments that point to consciousness as the nature of consciousness being immaterial, to even ask and answer these questions, one thing important to understand is what's called Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals. We can just call it Leibniz's law for short, and essentially states that if two things in question are identical, say some X and Y, then whatever is true of one is true of the other and vice versa. So if Eric Hernandez is the same person as your guest, then whatever is true of Eric Hernandez is true of your guest. Now this also implicitly gives us a test for identity. So take again some X and Y. If I can find just one thing true of X, not true of Y, or vice versa, they're not the same thing. Well, if we're just going to, for the sake of simplicity, if naturalism I would even argue that naturalism it's most logically consistent for a naturalist to be what's called a strict physicalist and say that consciousness is either identical or reducible to the physical. Either it is physical or, some say that it's caused by, dependent on, emergent from the physical. Setting that aside, you're going to have to make it somehow physical or pushing it that way. But given Leibniz's law of identity, we know they're not. Why? You take brain states and mental states. There are 5 states of consciousness: thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and volition, or acts of will. And even using Leibniz's law there, we know they're not the same. How so? Well, take a thought and belief. If there's one distinction between them, then they're not the same thing. And you can easily think of the fact that I can have beliefs that I'm not thinking, and I can think things that I don't believe. So they're not the same thing. So take a thought. A thought can have the property of being true or false, but a brain state can't have the property of being true or false. My brain can be in a state that weighs 3 pounds. The thought I'm talking to you doesn't weigh 3 pounds.
So what do you mean by brain state?
Right. So a state would be a mode that a thing is in. So if we look at something like water, water is a substance, and it can exist in 3 different states. And if you know the properties of a thing, it'll point you to the kind of state it's in, and it'll even tell you about its nature. It'll tell you something about its nature. So if I say water is in a solid state, has a property of solidity, it's in a solid state, and it tells you the kind of thing water is. It at least gives you some clues. So a brain state would be something like neurons firing, or something that the brain's doing, neuroplasticity, elasticity, whatever the brain's doing. It's in a certain state. And suffice to say that there are states of the mind and brain and vice versa, that it can be true of one thing but not the other. So again, they're different. So consciousness can't be identical or reducible to the physical. That's kind of how I just kind of quickly make that point. So now if consciousness is not physical, then the next question is, what is the thing that possesses consciousness? And conscious mental state.
So let me back up just a little bit. So it sounds. I mean, you're making this. You're appealing to this Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals, and is that what it's called?
Yes.
Identicals.
Yep.
And so, but you're pointing to, like, you're contrasting. Okay, this thing X versus this thing Y, and you're saying this thing X has at least one property that Y does not have.
Something true of it, sure.
Something true of it, yeah. Well, yeah. So it has this true property, and this one doesn't have that true property. And so when it comes to a brain state, I think one of the things that you said is that, like, a thought can be true, right? But then you said that a brain state cannot be true,
right?
And so that would show that you've got these 2 different properties that these 2 things have, and that would show that they're not identical to each other.
Right. Identical. Right? Yeah. And
so a thought cannot be identical to some physical brain state.
Yeah, that's right.
And what you're thinking of here, right? And when you're saying a brain state, is like a neuron or like
a certain. So a state would be like an event. But
it would be like a physical event happening in your brain.
Right. A brain state would have to be a physical event, right?
Yeah.
And then mental events aren't physical. So, and we can show that by showing they don't share the same properties. An illustration I've given is, like, say you walk into a lab and you see 2 bottles of clear fluid, and without using any tools, scientific tools, you want to ask, are they the same substance? So what you can do is apply Leibniz's law of identity, and you see that they're both fluids. They both have the property of being clear. So you assume at this point perhaps they're the same substance, because one says water, but the other one says chemical X. But let's say the label is ripped off. So you think they're the same substance until you turn over the one with the label ripped off and it says constant flammable. And you think, well, I know water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what chemical this is, I at the very least know they cannot be the same thing, because one has a property true of it that's not true of the other.
Yeah.
So it's a really, really helpful test. So if consciousness is not physical, we can then ask what possesses it. And mental properties are what are called kind-defining properties. By knowing the property, kind-defining properties tell us about the kind of thing needed or required to ground or possess it. So the simple way to put it is thoughts have thinkers. So if there's you can't have a thought without there being a thinker. So if consciousness exists and it's immaterial, what possesses it? Well, I know one thing for certain that possesses consciousness, and that is me. And I use the word I possess consciousness. The word I is what's called an indexical word. It refers to things like here and there are indexical. So what is the I, or self? the word I. So that being said, if I possess consciousness and it's immaterial, what kind of thing am I? And then this goes into, again, without going into all the complicated details of it, I'm going to argue that I'm not identical nor reducible to the physical. Again, using Leibniz's law of identity. Like if I retain identity through change and part replacement, then I'm not identical or reducible to the physical. Jaegwon Kim, a secular philosopher, gives a really interesting argument for that. Just to kind of explain it, he says something like, in 2011, this brain and body did not exist. Because every 7 to 10 years, your body replaces almost every cell. So he says in 2011, this brain and body didn't exist, but I did exist in 2011, therefore I'm not identical or reducible to a brain and body. So what kind of thing am I? I would say that given that consciousness is immaterial, it's a defining property, well then you would need some immaterial substance to ground it, namely the soul, is what I'm going to jump to. Now, all that to say, for something to be conscious, I would argue it needs a soul. And then let's look at something like AI. There's a lot of problems with saying that AI would be conscious. One is, I would argue that it would need to have a soul to be conscious in the first place. And we talked about kind-defining properties. When you look at everything that exists is going to have a nature, an essence, and that essence is going to set limitations of what it can and cannot do. An acorn's essence, its nature, has the ultimate capacity to be put in the dirt and grow into an oak tree. But if I put you in the dirt, that won't happen. So that shows me that your ultimate capacity doesn't contain that faculty capacity. So there are limitations to a thing's capacities given its nature. Now, if we're going to take a physicalist perspective, then you're going to have to assume by looking at the physical, there's going to have to be some kind of indicators, and I'm kind of simplifying for the sake of time, indicators that there are at least potentially these capacities to at least possess consciousness to begin with. Suffice to say, I don't see any, unless you just assume panpsychism, which I think has other problems. But it was, I think, Leibniz who said, he was one of the first to kind of argue that if you were to like walk into a big mill room and you would see objects pushing and pulling against each other, where would consciousness fit in all that stuff? When you look at if you were to shrink down to like the level of an atom and go into a brain, you see that it's not a whole in and of itself. Because another thing that consciousness would require would be a substantial whole, not an aggregate. What's an aggregate? A collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. Lego bricks are aggregates. So if you're just a brain and body, you're just Lego bricks, for lack of a better word, put together. Where would consciousness fit, so to speak, in that? You would need something that is a whole that can unite all your mental properties and states. I can touch on an argument later if you want, further going into that we talked about before the show. So, now, with AI, here's an interesting thought experiment to kind of switch gears that atheist philosopher John Searle puts forward to argue that AI is not going to be conscious. From a physicalist perspective, and something like strict physicalism is a view that you're a purely physical object with purely physical properties, parts, and substances. Searle, if you're going to do that then you're going to have to, again, make mental properties identical or reducible to the physical. One such mental property is things like intentionality. You're going to have to make intentionality somehow identical or reducible to the physical, or explain it in physical terms if the naturalist wishes to fit this into his ontology of stuff that exists. And one of the attempts was to identify a mental state by its inputs and outputs, its causal roles. So, as a substance dualist, which is essentially the view that I am a soul, an immaterial substance with something physical as well. That's, again, just oversimplifying here. Whereas for a physicalist, again, everything is going to have to be either identical or reducible or explainable by the physical. As a dualist, I would identify a mental state by its qualia. What is that? Its intrinsic feeling or texture to it. So if I ask you, how do you know if you're in pain or pleasure, what would your answer be?
Say that again?
How do you know if you're in pain or pleasure?
I introspect on my mental states.
Right. You don't need to plug up to some kind of machine, right? You don't. There's no. It's immediate and it's privately accessible to you, and so forth. So we identify mental states by what it is like to be in that kind of a mental state. And intentionality is one of those mental states that, again, I don't think can be reduced. So what the attempt is, well, let's identify pain as when you get stuck with a pin, you shout ouch. So certain inputs will cause certain outputs, and that's how we can identify the mental state of pain. The problem with that, there's lots of problems, but I mean, inverted qualia could be something where, like, let's say I poke you with the pin, and instead of that causing a mental state of pain, it causes a sensation of tasting banana. But tasting banana also causes you to say ouch. Yet on this reduced perspective of what a pain state is, it would have to follow that you're in pain, even though you're not, you're tasting banana. So here's what sorrow does to kind of show that when it comes to AI. First, to say that AI is conscious, I think you're going to have to assume that type of reduced way of identifying mental states of inputs and outputs. In other words, saying AI is consciousness, I think, presupposes that you can identify consciousness by its inputs and outputs. Sorrow says no, that you can't, and he gives what's called the Chinese room argument. I don't know if you've heard that before.
Yeah, no, I've definitely heard of it, and this is all very interesting. I mean, it kind of reminds me of Alvin Plantinga's point in his book. I think it's just called God and Other Minds, where he points out that there really are no good arguments for other minds.
Right. Yeah.
So it's kind of what's being brought up in my mind as or as you're talking about this.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Because that's even another problem with how do we know anybody's conscious?
Right.
Couldn't there be a possible world in which everything moves and acts the same, and yet there's no consciousness? And I think we call those P zombies. Right. Yeah. So John Sorrow, the Chinese room argument, for those that aren't familiar, he says, suppose that you put this guy in this room, and you lock the door, and there's two slits in this room, and he can't get out. And beside him, there's this rule book, and it says when someone passes in a squiggly, squaggly line, you pass out in this other bin that you have, pass out the squaggly, squiggly lines. And let's suppose this guy gets so good at this that every time a squiggly, squaggly line comes in, he looks at the rule book. Okay, now I pass out a squaggly, squiggly, and then all the different variations. He gets so good at this, he doesn't even need the rule book anymore. And now he's just like, as soon as it comes in, he's handing it out. Now, let's also suppose that unbeknownst to him, these lines, squiggly, squaggly lines, are questions in Chinese, and what he's passing out are answers in Chinese. Sorrow's point is that from an outside observer, it looks as if the person inside the room, or the room itself, is completely fluent in Chinese, and yet the dude doesn't know a lick of Chinese. He doesn't even know he's doing Chinese. And his point is that you can imitate conscious behavior, but that doesn't follow that such a thing is conscious to begin with. Just like you can imitate being fluent in Chinese doesn't make you fluent in Chinese. A computer, artificial intelligence imitating conscious behavior doesn't prove that it is therefore conscious. And I think that saying something is conscious would have to assume that type of reduced view of identifying mental states by inputs and outputs.
Yeah, I think I like that argument because, it kind of puts the perspective back on, like, we've got to establish what is consciousness in the first place.
That's right.
I mean, because we kind of know that, I mean, all of our experiences are based in a being that is conscious. So we know what it's like, but then, how do you actually go out and test something like AI? Because there's a whole lot of videos, and like, I think there was some, now I'm not going to remember correctly, but there was some, like, Google, someone at Google was claiming that their AI had started to say that it was sentient or conscious or something like that. And then, like, what do you do if an AI does start to say something like that? Can you trust it? And so I think it, because what you're kind of pointing out here with the Chinese room experiment is that just because something is giving you the right input-output,
right,
that does not mean that it's conscious.
Right.
Right. And so then it's just going to come back to the arguments for how anything can be conscious in the first place.
Yep.
And then if your argument is successful, that you need a soul in order to ground consciousness, then that's what you're going to need in order to show that something like AI is going to be conscious in the first place.
Right. Yeah. So by implication, again, given that thoughts have thinkers, the thinker would be the soul, and then the thought would be the mental states and properties. So in other words, if you're going to say that a physical machine is conscious, then you're going to have to ask what possesses that. Is it this part over here or this part over here? Now note though, this is saying that consciousness is not identical or reducible to the physical is not to say that there are no correlations or cause and effect relations or dependence relations. So, Moreland says something like, fire causes smoke, but it doesn't prove that smoke and fire are the same thing. I've often used like a guitar illustration or with an instrument that, these certain keys on a piano cause the note C, but they're not reducible to each other. So just because there's a cause effect doesn't mean they're the same thing. In fact, I don't know of any dualist that would deny cause and effect relations like that. And I bring that up to say, if a computer is conscious, again, not just saying that these parts of the computer are associated with this kind of programming, where are those thoughts and what grounds those thoughts? And that's why I'd say, well, then you would need to have some kind of a soul, but where would you put that thing, so to speak? And even suffice to say that if you don't have something in the base properties, or at least some indication that this thing's nature has the ultimate capacity to possess these ultimate capacities like consciousness, you have no reason to believe that it's going to be consciousness. So if we, at best, someone can say, well, perhaps a soul could emerge from this. And I think that gets into other problems because I think, I don't know if it was Nagel or Jagwan Kim that basically argue, and you even mentioned Rasmussen says something like this, you're not going to get some, hopefully I'm pronouncing this right, sui generis. You know how to pronounce that word? Sui generis?
I think that's
sui
how you say
generis.
it, yes, sui generis.
You're not going to get some totally radically different kind of property emerging from things that are unlike the subvenient base. What at best you're going to get are what are called structural properties. So take throw some wooden boards together. These 10 wooden boards have the property of being a pile of wooden boards. What I can do is I can rearrange those, and then now I have a raft. And now the same base parts can now have the property of being a raft. But note, it's not a new kind of entity. It's just a new pattern and configuration that gives it a new structural property, not a sui generis, totally different property. So take the physical stuff, even computer hardware or whatever. If there is no consciousness there to begin with, and Plantinga gives a similar argument when it comes to the brain, but if there's no consciousness there to begin with, how are you going to rearrange Lego bricks, if you will?
Yeah.
And then boom, consciousness pops into existence. Plantinga says something like, take a look at the brain, it's an aggregate. Let's look at the very base, like an atom or quark or lepton, whatever the lowest is. Is that conscious? No. Okay, throw together 1 million of those, and then you get an atom. Is that conscious? No. Throw a few million, however many it takes, then you get a cell, and then eventually you get a brain. At what point is consciousness going to pop into this bad boy? Mm-hmm. Now, what some people at this point are going to say is, well, that's the fallacy of composition is often the accusation. And if we could see the chat, I guarantee you there's someone in there shouting that as well. What's the fallacy of composition? It's the accusation that I'm saying that because
a property doesn't exist in the parts, it doesn't exist in the whole.
Right, exactly. Now, the problem with that kind of accusation is that, first of all, it's a case-by-case basis. Because if I took 100 red bricks and constructed a small house, then yes, the property of these bricks being red will also entail that the whole house is going to be red, all things being equal. So it's a fallacy of composition is a case-by-case basis. But what I'm arguing is more like you're not going to take a whole bunch of red bricks, rearrange them, and get the color blue from a mere structural rearrangement. So at best, all you're going to get are structural properties, not sui generis, different kind of properties like consciousness. So then the burden of proof is on the person, proposing that AI can be conscious to show, one, how can this happen metaphysically? What indications do you have that these physical states have the ultimate capacity within their nature to even possess consciousness? How do you define or identify a mental state? Because again, if you're going to go to inputs and outputs, we just go back to what Sarl's saying. And it's not a fallacy of composition, because we're not talking about, it's a case by case. And on top of that, the fallacy of composition has to do with something like, if I'm not mistaken, called property transfer. Because I'm not saying that this thing has property X and it's going to be transferred into the bigger thing. I think there are cases like that. But note, saying that a quark or cell or atom is not conscious, I'm not saying that an atom possesses not consciousness and that property of not consciousness passes on into the bigger thing of it being not conscious, because negative properties don't exist. I'm not a bear, but I don't possess a property of not being a bear. You don't have negative properties. So even then, I'm not saying that not consciousness is a property that's going to be passed on to everything else. I'm saying we have no reason to believe it, and the burden of proof would be on the other person to show that we would expect consciousness to exist.
Yeah, Rasmussen, I haven't got to that part in the book. I'm only in the first, I don't know, 30, 40 pages so far. But toward the end of the book, he's been mentioning at the beginning that he's going to eventually provide all these different construction problems that arise out of trying to construct consciousness out of these sort of more fundamental building blocks.
Right.
And how it just seems really impossible. It's not just a matter of like, oh, this is unlikely.
Metaphysically
it's more like,
impossible.
It's more like, yeah, you can't take different particles of dust, arrange them brain-wise, and then expect consciousness to just emerge from that, because it's the wrong type of material. And then the question is, well, what type of material do you need? And then it kind of goes back to like, well, maybe you need something like a soul or something that already has consciousness, kind of like what you've been saying. There was something else I kind of wanted to come back to. So the one of the things that you said in response to AI being conscious is that it's going to be really difficult to actually determine or come to some like reasonable conclusion that it is conscious. There's just no really good test. We can't like go in ourselves and like experience consciousness on their behalf or anything like that. So how do you actually do it? So that's one concern, one worry about like actually identifying it.
The problem of other minds.
Right. And then, but then the separate question is, do your arguments for dualism actually work? Right? Is there reason to think that we've got to appeal to a soul in order to account for conscious states? Because if we don't, then maybe we could just be like, okay, maybe we can't particularly identify when something is conscious or not, sure, but it's at least possible, right? Because this person would be sort of rejecting your arguments for dualism. One option that came to mind, Rasmussen has mentioned it, I think, at the very beginning chapters. What is it called? It's not emergentism. Eliminativism. So someone could just deny that they have thoughts that can be true or false, and so it's not that you have like this thing that has this property and this thing that doesn't have this property, and so you've got like a disconnect and they're not identical. Rather, what the eliminativist does is they just literally eliminate our consciousness. So what about that option?
So I would think that they would be biting the bullet, and then so by default AI can't be consciousness because there is no consciousness. It just doesn't exist. So they would actually be on my side in this case. Frank Jackson, he basically argues that if a naturalist is going to be consistent, he's going to have to, when he finds a quote problematic entity, he has two options. He can either reduce it and make it, and I'm paraphrasing here, like reduce it or make it identical to the physical or something like that, or he has to eliminate them from his ontology. And some philosophers have gone that route. Like, Alex Rosenberg, he'll say he doesn't have any beliefs, and you just have to ask him if he believes that, right? So to deny consciousness, it leads to such absurd, self-defeating, kind of things. And I think this is why what's becoming popular, and it's interesting because, like I said, and like we've kind of even talked about.
I honestly never could have guessed, getting into apologetics, that I was going to find people that just deny that consciousness exists.
Now, I think they're being logically consistent, which I can appreciate, right?
Yeah. I mean, Rasmussen even has some, like, he surveys some arguments for eliminativism. Yeah. So it's like they have reason to think that they don't have any...
Their thoughts and beliefs have reason to give them that they have no thoughts and beliefs. Right.
It's very strange.
But again, they're trying to be logically consistent, and I think like what Jackson says is you have to locate these somehow in this grand naturalist story, or you have to eliminate them. And I think this is why men like Thomas Nagel and a few others that escape my mind at the moment are now kind of punting, and I would say punting to something like Panpsychism.
It's becoming way more popular.
It is, because
there's a famous guy. Well, is he famous? Philip Goff. I'm sure you've seen him. Yeah, he's been on Joe Rogan. He's been on a bunch of the big shows. So he's probably more famous than we are.
Oh, yeah. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, he's been on those shows.
We got to get Craig on Rogan's show now.
I know.
So
hopefully.
I think it's showing, though, that what's always been interesting in just the history of this kind of stuff is Christianity and philosophy of religion in general is Christians put this up and then atheists kind of, it's almost like playing chess, right? You're making the next move. So I think that now, like, I think consciousness in the academic area is starting to really, or it has been really gaining traction. In fact, John Searle, an atheist philosopher of mind, has said something like how he's embarrassed for the past 50 years in the philosophy of mind, how people who have tried to defend or articulate physicalism have just done a horrible job, and he says it's been a waste of time. There's an atheist philosopher saying this about philosophers of mind who are naturalists. Now, without going to his option, there's this realization that, okay, let's not be self-defeating. So what can we do? And I think the best option is to punt to a panpsychism where say, okay, the physical doesn't create consciousness, but what if we just front load it and just put it in everything to begin with? So under the right physical conditions, the matter in this chair can be conscious. Now, I think I've heard Moreland say something like, well, bless our hearts. I mean, that's a great attempt, you know, but note what they're implicitly conceding. If it's not there to begin with, you're not going to get it by rearranging stuff. And what I think is most ironic is, wait a minute, so you're punting to the idea that ultimate reality at its core must be mental. Well, why not just become a Christian? You know, it's like you're trying to take that cake and eat it too. So yeah, I mean, they can eliminate it, but again, it's become popular now to kind of lean towards panpsychism. I think that gets into other problems that, you know, we don't necessarily have to talk about. But what I think it's showing is the weight that the soul and consciousness kind of plays into these discussions.
Yeah. The initial kind of thought that came to my mind with respect to panpsychism, we were talking about it a little bit. Whoops. Now you guys can see me. We were talking about it before the show, before we started, was the problem of the unity of consciousness, right? And so even if you have every fundamental particle has some level of consciousness, and then you throw it all together, you throw a bunch of them together in a particular arrangement, and then you get some higher level of consciousness. How does that actually work? How do you get from these different fundamental things that each of themselves have some sort of level of consciousness? How do you then get a single unit of consciousness that has this sort of like movie-like experience of the world? And how does that work? I'm sure that that was one of the things that you could have brought up if you wanted to.
So why do you need a substantial self to kind of ground consciousness, to possess consciousness and whatnot? So Eric LaRocque has an interesting argument, which is kind of similar to Hasker's argument. Hasker's argument is the unity of consciousness. LaRocque focuses on the unified visual field of consciousness. And the way I've typically argued it, and I'll use his illustration as well and kind of modify it, is so if we have two options on the table, that either you are a substantial whole, and I would say that would have to be something like a soul, or you're an aggregate. If for the physicalist, and there's different versions, but suffice to say that you are an aggregate, again, Lego bricks, if you will. I'm not a substantial whole. And there's different types of part-to-whole relations. Like you take a heap of sand, you can call that a whole, but you can see how it's only a whole in the sense that there are certain parts spatially located close together. But then it becomes a problem, which is kind of what you're leaning at. Well, there's a piece of sand over there. Do we count that as part of this heap, or do we have to move it? How close does it have to be? Yeah, you get into those kind of with mereological problems. And then take a car. Well, that seems to still be an aggregate, but it's a much deeper whole connection than a heap of sand. And then you take a living organism like us. Well, so you have this hierarchy. And I would say that the soul, well, here's what Moreland once said, is that the soul is mereologically simple but metaphysically complex. So it's not a collection of separable parts. It's a single substantial whole. All that to say is you're going to need some whole to ground these things. And now let's go to Eric LaRocque's argument. So and the way I modify it is, okay, if I'm either a soul, a material substance, or an aggregate, a collection of parts. Well, if I am an aggregate, then I'm not going to have a unified visual field. Let's say that's the second premise. Now, why not? We now know through neuroscience that when I look at an object, and again, the dualist, for some reason people think dualists deny this. Like an objection I get from like non-believers is, yeah, but if, I don't know, like Alzheimer's can make you lose your memory. I'm like, right, go on. Sure. No different than, detuning a guitar while I'm playing it is going to affect the sound. Like, sure, what's your point? So we now know through neuroscience that not only are we able to see more cause and effect relationships with certain mental states, we also know that what brain regions or brain firings are correlated with certain mental states. So when I look at an object, we know that certain regions of my brain are correlated with certain aspects of an object, like the size, the shape, the distance, the color, whether it's in motion or rest. But these correlating brain states terminate in certain parts of the brain. In other words, there is no part of the brain that takes all these little pieces and puts them together. So if you think, so you're a photographer, right? We're capturing Christianity here. If I were to take a picture and pixels, if you threw, hypothetically, if you can get a box of pixels and throw them, or a puzzle, let's say, right? You throw on the floor. Well, you're not going to see the whole picture unless you have something that puts the picture together into one unified field. LaRocque argues that, why do we have a unified visual field? Why, when I look at an object, I don't just see first the color and then I see the shape and then, why do I see all of it together? So here's his illustration, which, again, I'm modifying. He says, suppose you have 5 chefs working on a recipe for a cake. And you take these 5 chefs, but they're each working on a certain part of the recipe. And you put them in 5 different kitchens. What do you need to get a whole unified cake? Because them being in separate parts of the kitchen isn't going to work. Now, some have argued, well, if they're all working on it at the same time, you'll eventually get that cake. Well, no, you still won't, especially given, this is why I kind of push further and say, well, let's say they're locked in separate kitchens, whatever. In order to get a quote-unquote unified whole cake, you're going to need a master chef to get those ingredients they finished working on and then put those into one whole cake. So LaRocque argues, well, that's what you need a soul for. You need something transcendent to the physical that is going to take these aspects that are correlated with these brain states. This part of the brain terminates and is correlated with the color, this part, this. You're going to need some master chef, if you will, that takes all those properties of that object in your unified visual field and put them together into a panoramic, if you will, and have this whole unified conscious visual field cake, if you will. So to even have something like a unified visual field, you're going to need something to ground all those properties that you're looking at.
So I'd like to, at this point, discuss a couple objections to dualism, and then we can kind of move to talk about some debates that you've done.
Oh yeah,
and that should be a lot of fun. So the first, I may just raise one. So this is probably the most well-known objection: the interaction problem. How does the mental interact with the physical?
Yeah,
right. And so, what are your thoughts on this problem? First of all, articulate it for the audience.
Yeah. So the interaction problem, it's really a question. As we know here, questions aren't arguments. It's really a question as well. How does something immaterial act on the physical and whatnot, or even vice versa?
What is the mechanism? Or
right? Hasker, I think it was Hasker who said something like that is like the most, what did he call it? Like the most overrated objection, like in philosophy. He's like, I'm tired of hearing that. Like it's not a good objection. It's not even an objection. Honestly, it's a question. And I think I first heard Moreland point this out, that it's really an epistemic question, not an ontological question. Because if my arguments pass, which I haven't shared all of them, but just from what we've talked about, if my arguments pass that a soul exists, and your question is, well, how does it interact with the body? Note that does nothing to affect my ontological arguments that souls are required for these features of reality, like mental states. So at best, it's a question, not an objection, and on top of that, it's epistemic, not ontological. Because I could say, I don't know. Now, what follows from that? Nothing. I'm not very good with cars. I'm not a mechanic. But if I drive my car to get here, I say, oh, I've got a car and it works great and it exists. You say, but how does it work? Oh my gosh, I don't know. My car doesn't disappear from the driveway. It's still there. There's just something I'm ignorant about. Okay, so that's one thing to say on that. The other thing to say is, this also seems to
we
assume...
do know how the mental interacts with the physical.
There are different, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. But another thing to say is, because at first, let's look at what are the assumptions behind the question, because I kind of touched on
what is a negative answer actually going to imply?
Right. Yeah.
Nothing.
And then what is a question even trying to get at?
Yeah.
And what is a question assuming? Because the question also seems to assume that there is an intermediate mechanism that A interacts with B by way of C. Mm-hmm. So they're presupposing that you need some intermediate mechanism. But let's go there for a second. First, I disagree. There might be, but I don't think you need that. But let's say there is. Well, then the next question would just become, well, how does A interact with C in order to interact with B? Well, then you're going to have to posit another mechanism, and then another, and then you get to this infinite regress. So I think the best way to see this is to see that it's a basic primitive action. There is no intermediate mechanism. Same thing with if you ask, how did I get here? Well, first, I got into my car, then I drove this, and I give you the directions. But at some point, I'm going to need to just say, I put the key in the ignition. Like, that's where it starts, right? There has to be... It can be just an A to B there. It doesn't have to be an intervening mechanism. Otherwise, you lead to an infinite regress. As a side note, too, one of the arguments I use for the soul is the existence of free will. Without going into those details, suffice to say that if you're just a purely physical object, then purely physical objects don't act on their own. They're caused to act by external forces. So if I'm purely physical, I would argue that a necessary and sufficient condition for libertarian free will is that you're the first mover. You're not caused by something else. Well, if I'm just physical, I'm going to necessarily be caused by something else because I'm not going to move. I'm not going to be a first mover, so you don't have free will. So the question also seems to assume that you can't have something immaterial because it can't act on the physical, where I may push back and say, but if you don't have something immaterial to act on the physical, you're not going to have libertarian freedom, and I think that leads into a whole other range of problems epistemically and all this other stuff. But that's just kind of like a side note. Now, let's go to, okay, what are the possible responses to how this interaction can happen? There's a few things. One would be, so Moreland has said something like, because what some people try to argue on top of the question, in other words, to try to make it an argument. I think Sean Carroll may have done something like this, where they say that you're not going to, you can't create new energy. It's a closed system, so to speak. But then Moreland kind of pushes back and says, well, that you're assuming it's a closed system, but it could be, well, if God exists, maybe it's not a closed system. And the same might apply. Just like God can interact in the physical.
Or it's just closed around God.
Yeah.
Yeah, like God is part of the system.
Sure, yeah. Just as God can interact in the physical, why can't my soul interact in the physical? In fact, it's a loose analogy, but one way that one can think of our soul in relation to a body is just as God is omnipresent to the universe, my soul is omnipresent to my body. Now, again, without going into like heresy, because when I wiggle my toe and wiggle my finger, my soul doesn't have to travel from here to there, and vice versa. I have causal active power at every point in my body. So, one, it might not be the case that we're in a closed system. And then two, it could be the case that maybe there is some energy created, but the energy that's created is indetectable, because then the question is, well, we should be able to see where the soul is interacting, which I think is weird to ask that. And the reason is, like I've heard non-believers, an objection would be, well, we've never seen a mind without a brain. Mm-hmm. And I always say, well, rewind. Show me when you've ever seen a mind to begin with. You haven't. That goes back to the problem of other minds. Like, well, we need a way to empirically, test it. Well, how do you empirically know there's a mind first? That goes back to the Chinese room argument, all that other stuff. So, in other words, I think that's a bad way to object to the soul. But Moreland says it could be that there is energy released, but the amount of energy being released is so insignificant to what's being done. So he uses the illustration. Suppose you go to the Hoover Dam, and there's one switch that if you just flip the switch, it will release all the water. Now, compare the energy used to flip the switch with the energy that is released when all the water comes out. I mean, it's going to drown, no pun intended, the energy of flipping that switch. So he's like, well, maybe the soul does create some kind of energy, but you're not going to detect it because of the amount of energy that's being released, with that. But then there's, I think this is more recent, which is really interesting, is appealing to something like quantum entanglement. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I had to look up when I first heard it, but essentially...
Isn't that the spooky action at a distance
yes,
type thing?
That's right. It's essentially the idea, and we know this happens, that by doing, let's say you have two atoms, or I don't know if it's particles, I'm more of a philosopher than a scientist, and even that's a bit of an exaggeration. So I don't know the exact words, but you have these two things, and by either observing or doing one or measuring one, it has a cause effect on the other thing, and they're so far separated that there is no interaction between them.
Well, it's also instantaneous.
Yes, that's right.
So it's like, that's why they call it spooky action at a distance. It's because like you interact with this thing over here, and then it affects this thing way over here
right.
immediately.
For
And it's like,
Halloween-
how does that happen?
Right. For Halloween, you should do an episode on that, the spooky interaction.
Yes. Good idea. I don't have a pencil. I read it
It's
down.
being recorded.
Oh, yeah.
So, so when you have this quantum entanglement, there's no energy really, unless I'm getting this wrong. But basically, in other words, you don't really need to do anything, and there's no transfer of energy between these two things. So it could be the case that the soul, that there's some kind of relation to that the soul does something that doesn't take any kind of energy being created, but by doing something, even if it's observing or introspecting, whatever, has an effect on the physical. So which of those options, and there's other options, which of those work or is true, I don't know. At the end of the day, I'll say I think it's a primitive basic action, and I'm perfectly fine with saying I don't know the exact details, just like I drove my car here, even though I don't know the details. But suffice to say, there are responses out there to it, but just to recap, it's not an objection, it's a question. It's not an ontological argument or anything against it. It's epistemic. Nothing is lost, even if we say, I don't know, and there are sufficient answers that people have argued for and how to explain that.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I think the appropriate response is just say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, why are you so concerned about that? You know,
Are you
isn't
okay?
Isn't the question? Yeah, isn't the question like, doesn't a soul actually exist? Right?
Yeah.
If that's what we are, as opposed to how it all works. I like your illustration of the car too. It's like I drove here, but I don't know how all the parts work.
And it disappears.
We're millennials. We don't know any of that stuff. Oh man, I was gonna discuss. I don't know if I was gonna discuss another objection to dualism. No, this was tying in dualism to AI again. So you at one point mentioned that like it's not that like your soul, when you wiggle your finger and your toe, it's not that your soul has to like travel. And what that got me thinking of is it is kind of strange that God has decided to tie our souls in one sense to these sort of meat sacks, like these physical bodies, right? Like he could have.
I'm going to jot a note down because you reminded me of something. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah. So he could have seemingly, seems possible that he could have tied our souls to some other objects. And so this has raised questions of like a friend of mine, and he's got his own YouTube channel. He's an apologist. Parker, Sedecase has asked the question on several occasions, could God have put my soul in a desk? Right. And so that's actually an interesting question. I'm looking at my desk right now. It's actually a really interesting philosophical question. Could God have actually put the soul and made it put it into a desk? And if that's the case, then it does seem that God could have put a soul into like coordinated with an AI system or something like that. So that's one way that AI could be conscious, is if God decided to sort of give it a soul maybe. So what are your thoughts on all of that?
I remember Parker, and shout to Parker. I remember he asked it on Facebook, and I gave a response. We went back and forth a little bit, and he said, "Oh, that's interesting, good stuff, man." So thanks for that, Parker. So I would say it's gonna depend on one's view of, and this is actually relates to what I wrote down, because to kind of tie these two things together, you asked, well, if we can create consciousness, what does that say about? I forget how you put it. God's role or something like that.
Like if we can create consciousness, like does that mean that we're gods in one sense, or
what are the theological implications?
Yeah.
So what I would say,
or like it doesn't seem that difficult.
For
God,
yeah. For God,
are there any implications on arguments for God from consciousness? Yeah.
So now this is going to get us deeper into the metaphysics, and I would say the relevant question is, well. So when it comes to the origin of the soul, there's two dominant views. There's the creationist view of the soul and the traducian view of the soul. And the creationist, not to be confused with young earth creationism or anything like that. It's and I'm gonna oversimplify. So if you're gonna get mad at me for that, whatever. For the sake of making the point, on the creationist view of the soul, when the right physical conditions are there, God zaps, if you will. He kind of puts that soul into that physical body. Yeah, he creates it and puts it in there. And as a side note, I wonder if that would. So I don't hold to a creationist view of the soul. I wonder if that could an argument be made about God resting and no longer creating. Could the creationist view could it be debunked, if you will, by saying that God's no longer created? I don't know. Nevertheless, that's the creationist view. On the traducian view, it gets a little more interesting. and technical, but essentially, see your body kind of like your biological tissue is infused with what's called soulish totipotentiality. It has the potential. Put it this way: when you sever a starfish arm and you put it to the side, that severed arm has the potential and can actually become a new starfish. But no reproduction has occurred. So that kind of seems weird. Even with in cases of pregnancy, you have twinning, where the baby splits, and I do say baby, not just fertilized egg. There's a split, and you have two persons. Again, no reproduction. So what I think this does is, I would say for the most part, neuroscience is almost utterly irrelevant. And Moreland has said something that strong before to questions about the soul. And that any view on the soul is going to be what's called empirically equivalent. Let's say you're a physicalist, I'm a substance dualist. We're not going to disagree on any of the scientific data. Our disagreements are going to be metaphysical and philosophical, are going to be our disagreements. But I do think that there are times where in a posteriori way, after the fact, that we look at things and it gives implications to something like the soul. So in the Traducian view, suffice it to say that God has set up the world in such a way that, for the sake of simplicity, let's say animals, and let's include humans and call them rational animals, that their biological tissue, that their soul is, again, omnipresent throughout, like sugar and water. If you were to stir it, it's kind of diffused all throughout it. And if that's the case, it could be that when a sperm and egg meet, you have you have a substantial change. Now, that's an important technical term, substantial change in metaphysics, and that was first used in metaphysics. Substantial change in the sense that you'll have some people say that, like, consciousness is an emergent property, and they'll point to water being wet. Wetness is an emergent property of water. Without going into all that, suffice to say that Moreland would argue that the existence of new properties, if anything, shows the existence of a new substance coming into existence. And again, going back to the essence thing, your nature is going to set limits, and your nature is what grounds your what you can possibly do, the capacity. So if you have new properties that weren't in the subvenient basis, then it's likely that a new substance has emerged. And suffice it to say that when you get these two, sperm and egg, with soulish totipotentiality come together, you have a new substance, namely the soul, and then that begins to form the body of the stuff it has to work with. I hold to that view for a few reasons, but here's where I want to relate it to. If we look at Genesis, I talked with Moreland over the phone. No big deal, whatever. One time. But he says that Genesis is an apologetic, is written apologetically, not against non-believers, atheists, but against the pagans. How so? Because, well, the obvious would be like, God created the sun, so don't worship the sun, right? Because God created that.
Yeah.
But the less obvious is that if you notice repeated throughout there, he says, let everything reproduce after its kind whose seed is in itself. What seems to be the implication apologetically was, you pagans think that in order to, for your crops and, to be fertile, you're going to have to do these certain religious ritual orgies to entice your gods to make things fertile. But no, God has set up the whole world in such a way that everything already has a capacity to reproduce after its kind, and everything that's in itself it has what it needs within itself to reproduce that thing. That seems to be an implication also of a Traducian view. So, in other words, so when you talked about, if we could create consciousness, what would that imply theologically? Well, I don't think we are creating consciousness, just like we're not, quote unquote, at least not the way God is in this sense. For my wife and I to have a kid, that's not creation ex nihilo. All we're doing is taking the stuff God gave us, mixing that around, and given the metaphysical laws He's already instantiated, you're going to have things. So all you're doing is tinkering with what God gave us. If the Traducian view of the soul is true, and you need a soul to ground consciousness, then much like severing a starfish arm, or a twinning when they split, you're not creating consciousness. If anything, again, you're just tinkering with the psychophysical stuff, if you will, and using what God has already put in place to make something happen.
Gotcha. Okay, now let's move on to discussing some of your debates. I mean, that was a lot of fun to talk about AI and consciousness and stuff, and I'm sure that we're barely scratching the surface.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it did. I actually really appreciated the distinction between the creationist and the traducian. Why can I not say that word? Yeah, no, I like that because I mean, philosophy of mind is not really an area that I've done a lot of study in. I think I've been pretty open about that. So that's one of the reasons why I'm excited to read more of Josh's book. But that was really helpful and I'll want to think about that more. The difference between the two.
A side implication too. This is, I think, would be another reason why I would deny artificial intelligence being conscious, because it's not. There's no soulish totipotentiality within that physical stuff.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna kind of go there, but then I was like, well, let's just move on. Let's move on and talk about some other topics. Pay no mind to these super interesting things that we're gonna just ignore. So, but I would like to. I mean, I don't know how much time you have, but I haven't eaten lunch, so I'm pretty hungry. So we'll maybe wrap up a little bit. So, but I did want to discuss some of your other debates. I suppose I haven't watched every single debate that you've done.
What?
I know. You've done a lot. Like you've done a lot of debates, and not all of them are formal debates, right?
Right.
But are there any others that you would just kind of mention off the top of your head that kind of stick out to you that were important or funny or interesting?
Yeah, one of my favorite. Well, you said you were going to bring up Smalley. I did really like that one. One of my other favorite ones was the abortion debate I did with the. She was a feminist and a lawyer, and the executive director of NARO Pro-Choice, Texas.
Now, is this one online?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, have you not seen that one?
No. When was it?
It's one of my favorite. I don't know, 2017 maybe?
Oh, okay, so it was a long time ago. Maybe.
You did? And I think this is before, like, so you've always been the camera person, the aesthetic person, which I've always appreciated. And I think I uploaded, because here's what I'm getting at. The audio quality and the video quality was horrible. I don't know if the person who did that is watching or follows me, but suffice to say that there was a lot of red tape we had to go through to even do this debate.
Yeah.
The school didn't want to do it first and all this other stuff. And I remember when my friend calls me and he's like, hey, they're hesitant and they say they'll let you do it if you make it a discussion, not a debate. And I'm like, call it what you want. I'm coming to debate. I mean, I'll be respectful, whatever. When I get there the day of, I'm immediately met by, and I'm trying to be tread carefully here. I'm immediately met, suffice to say, by a...
You say suffice to say a lot.
I'm sorry. That's my way of telling myself to shut up and not be too detailed.
to just give the... Yeah,
that's my ADHD.
To summarize it.
My way of trying to... Suffice to say, it's my way of trying to...
It's probably a very helpful thing that I've now made you self-conscious of.
Oh, yeah, no, sure. So now I'm going to try not to say it, which is good.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Is that I was met by a lady who was on staff at the school with short hair, colored blue or purple, and tattooed up. Let's put it that way. Not pointing to any stereotypes or anything, but she said...
Sure.
She said something like, hey, just want to remind you, it's not a debate, it's a discussion, yada, yada, yada. And I said, I understand that. I said, but just to be clear, you do know I disagree with her, and I'm going to give my reasons why. And she goes, oh, yeah, we want this to be an exchange of ideas. I said, then we're good. But yeah, the quality in video was bad. The reason I said the red tape is because my friend actually asked if the school can record it, because it was a student-led organization. They should have certain access to stuff, but the school said no on everything. So last minute, someone he knew said I can do it for free. I have the equipment. He had the equipment and stuff. I don't think he just knew how to operate it properly.
Gotcha.
Put it that way.
Okay.
So I remember you even mentioning that. I'm like, yeah, I wish it was better quality. But yeah, that was one of my favorite debates because for a number of reasons. One, I expected more from her. And I mean, to give some highlights from that, I would take shameless plug real quick. Hopefully in June, my first book will be coming out, The Lazy Approach to Evangelism.
Interesting title.
Coco helped me pick it out.
I didn't notice that, or I didn't know that you were writing a book.
Yeah, I didn't really announce it because I didn't know the deadline and whatnot. And then, but yes. So one thing
I'm sure you've got him on speed dial as well.
It's whatever. he's calling me now. It's almost like a mixture of tactics and plus something else, because I was doing tactics before I knew what tactics was, just because my early exposure to philosophy and learning about logical fallacies, I kind of was able to implement that into discussions. But here's why I'm saying that, because I think that debate is a really good picture of that. I'll just give you one highlight for the sake of time. At one part of the debate, she said something like, there needs to be equal rights across the board, no matter of one's race, sex, religion, or sexual orientation. There needs to be equal rights. And then at another time in the debate, she said something like, we need to support a woman's decision to have an abortion, even if we disagree with their decision. It's not your position to judge the person. It doesn't matter if you agree with why they want to have an abortion. You should support her because that's her right. These were set at two different parts of the debate, and I use this in the book to kind of show how you want to look holistically at these things. So when it came to the cross-examination, I clarified. So equal rights no matter race, religion, orientation, yes. And you also think we should support a woman's decision even if we disagree? Yes. Okay. Hypothetical. As a thought experiment, I said, suppose, because, side note, I've been saying that a lot too, I think.
What, side note?
Side note, yeah. Her organization, if you can afford an abortion, her organization will pay for it for you. I guess I'm sure there's an approval application process. I don't know. So I said, so suppose a religious woman comes up to you, because remember, religion, no matter religion, orientation, whatever.
Right.
Religious woman comes up to you and says she wants an abortion, and her reasons are this. Suppose there was technology that could not only tell you the sex of the baby, but could even tell you the baby's sexual orientation. So this religious woman wants you to pay for her abortion because she doesn't want a gay baby. In this instance, are you still pro-choice? Because it seems like that if you are, well, then you're essentially okay with killing someone just because they're gay and for someone else's preferences. But if you say no, well, then you're going against a woman's decision, which according to you should be supported no matter what, even if you disagreed. So would you still be pro-choice in this instance? Mm-hmm. So I took what you said and just made a question out of it to expose the absurdity. She laughed nervously. You could hear a pin drop in that room after I asked that question. In fact, the moderator got really nervous. He was actually my friend, because there was already, throughout the debate, there was a few times where like the person who was there to supervise from the school was like pacing back and forth nervously. And so I'm just, it's quiet. She laughs. She takes a sip of water. She says, well, that technology doesn't exist. So, you know, and then people like laugh, right? And
yeah, that's not the answer.
So I said, well, it's a thought experiment. I said, but you know what? I said, let's run with that. Because, you know, I don't want to lose a crowd. And, you know, I said, let's run with that. Let's say it doesn't exist. Let's modify and say she was lied to by her pastor. It is nevertheless still her choice, her decision, and her belief. I want to know still, would you be pro-choice in this instance, yes or no? She never answered the question. She was beating around the bush, and the person supervising that debate, like, stomped up there and put, like, a piece of paper on the table, and it said something like, basically, like, move on and remind people this is not a debate. And so the moderator's like, let's just alleviate the tension and move it, and, like, cracked a joke, and we moved on. So, but, I mean, it was kind of like that throughout the whole debate. And afterwards, I got to pray with some young ladies. I had a few young ladies come up to me and say, I came either pro-choice or on the fence, but as a result of this debate, I'm leaving as a pro-life advocate. Wow. Yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, so I did want to discuss, and maybe we'll just talk about this and then we can end the stream today. So, and by the way, let me just mention one more time that we're doing all of this live, but my computer is like, what, 10, 15 feet away from me, so I can't read any of the comments that you guys are sending in live chat or anything. I don't even know if, like, I think you guys can hear us okay and everything looks fine, so
oh man,
we'll just horrible. it'd be horrible if we just wasted all of our time. But I guess I'll see in the comments after the stream is done.
On too. I was like, yeah. Turn this on?
No, it's all on. I can see our microphones like going up and down stuff. No, I did want to discuss briefly your chats with David Smalley, just because there was a time I was listening to a whole bunch of different various things and like becoming acquainted with different apologists and new apologists, and eventually I stumbled across you and your work. I don't remember when this was. It might have been around that time, 16, 17, 18, somewhere around there. And I remember listening to your dialogue with him, and I was just like, I thought two things. So first of all, I thought, like, how does this guy David Smalley like have an audience? First of all, and then second, it really you really impressed me in that dialogue, because you were very quick-witted on your feet, and I think that he was trying to get you to like trip up and trying to like ask you things or say things that were like supposed to like kind of trip you up, but you weren't tripped up at all. So I found that impressive, and then I think after that point, we became friends, or maybe we were already at that point. But anyways, any thoughts on those dialogues that you've had with him?
Yeah. So kind of one of the reasons I in the book that I'm coming out with, I kind of take even some of those experience and even sometimes. So I have ADHD, as people who know me know that, and it's a quote blessing and a curse. The blessing is that it's counterintuitive, but people with ADHD, yes, most have a problem with focusing. But if I find something that just intrigues me so much, it is now the opposite, where it's not that I can't focus, it is now hard to disrupt my focus or pull me away from this thing because now I'm hyper-focused. So that's kind of a counterintuitive superpower with ADHD. This is why you have kids playing Xbox for like 15 hours straight, and parents going to their psychiatrist saying, he can't have ADHD. How can he focus for 15 hours on video games? Well, it's because he's hyper-focused and he's intrigued by that. When it comes to the philosophy and stuff, that's kind of how I get, where I'm like hyper-focused. And then when it comes to debate, it's somewhat similar, and it's also the fact that I separate my emotions from the logic, which is weird because, they're like, I can be cold-hearted, so to speak, in some instances where I probably should be more emotional, but then I'll also like cry watching a Pixar movie or something like that. It's without going to all that. One of the things
Suffice
about
to say.
Yeah, suffice it to say, right, exactly, is that when I do debates with people like that, first I try to study my arguments, anticipate how my opponent might respond, but also
remind me what David was he? Did you just call into his show, or no? He invited you on, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, the demeanor of my opponent, because you'll also what I try to pay attention to. So anybody.
Yeah, no, I have noticed that. I think I know where you're going. That you sort of match the tone. Their tone.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
In some ways.
Yes, match the tone, but also.
It's like David is just super condescending. Usually when he's having.
I wasn't being condescending to him.
No. But you were. Maybe you were. I don't remember. But you were just
maybe
not
snark.
like. Well, you were. Yeah, you were very confident. You may have been using snark, but I just remember you kind of going like tit for tat.
Yeah, and like so Jesus did that, and I won't go into defense on that. But I look at what do they perceive as like confidence, or how do they try to wiggle out of something and call it out or something like that. So with Smalley, one of his things was like just incredulity, right? Mm-hmm. Where you make it. I've heard him. I can see why he has a following, but I also see the weakness in the way he's done that. So I've seen, without mentioning names, I've seen apologists that I know of go on his show, give a beautifully articulate argument, and then he says something like, "Oh, come on, you can't really believe that." Yeah. And the apologist gets kind of flustered and like, "Well, let me restate it. Why? That's not an objection. It's one of my tactical tools. Hat tip to Kokol is discerning whether they're giving you an argument or they're just making an assertion, because assertions don't merit responses, rebuttals, or refutations. So like one of my tactics is to just say, "Go on," and just stay quiet because you haven't given an argument. So that's one example. So in our debate, I give like I think it was the evolutionary argument, or maybe it was the consciousness thing. And I think
you did give the evolutionary argument against naturalism.
I did. I just don't remember the response. But
he couldn't grasp that.
He said something
argument.
like, after I explained, he's like, "Oh, come on."
Yeah.
He goes, "That's ridiculous." Knowing that's his tactic, my response was, "I know. That's why I'm not an atheist." Mm-hmm. To turn that incredulity on, it is ridiculous, and that's your worldview. And then he's like, "Oh, no, that's not what I meant," And so he did that like one more time, and I kind of said that again, and after that, he didn't use it anymore.
Interesting.
So it kind of took the wind out of that. His other things I've noticed is...
Well, before you get to the other thing, what I think this shows is that it does take a lot of, would you call it like emotional intelligence? Or like maybe rhetorical intelligence? Is that even like a word?
Yeah,
but
something like that. So gotta be messed up in the head like me.
Well, what can happen is inspiring philosophy, Michael Jones is really, really good about this. Yeah. So he knows from like a rhetorical standpoint, he needs to be super confident in this debate, or he needs to like say this or do this in order to come off rhetorically strong. And to be a good debater, to be a good apologist, especially if you want to go do live debates and stuff, you have to care about rhetoric. It's not enough. Yeah. I mean, even Dr. Craig, like if you just watch his debates, like he's super good with rhetoric. It doesn't really seem apparent on the face of it, but there's a lot of rhetoric behind it, and that's important for anyone. But what I think that this shows is that you sort of have like an innate care to match someone rhetorically, or have like these sort of rhetorical responses to make sure that you're not just winning in substance, you're also winning in rhetoric.
Right.
And that it's important, because the rhetoric sometimes can completely sway someone to the other person's side, even if they don't have the arguments or the evidence in their favor.
Yeah, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. And I, even having mentored other apologists, I put it this way, is that we're all called to engage in apologetics. I think 1 Peter 3:15 is a mandate, but we're not all called to engage in debate, and that's okay. I've never organized one of my own debates. I've never asked to debate anybody, and like in your words, I've done a lot of debates. So it hasn't been me looking for debates. I think I'm gifted in that area, and what that requires, I don't know, but you can still develop gifts and whatnot. All that to say is probably nothing I've been saying. So yes, it don't feel that to do apologetics you have to do live debates. In fact, that's a small portion of what some people may do. But if you're going to do debate, it's important to look at those things, because you don't.
Well, even if it's not a debate, strictly saying,
even in conversation,
if just a conversation, especially on this other guy's show, and if you're not, if you're, your approach, someone might listen back to that show with Eric and David and be like, well, I didn't really like Eric's approach here. I didn't like what he was, but that's not really the point. The point is, be prepared to have some type of response to the rhetoric that's going to be thrown your way, and just keep that in mind. It's not to say be a clone of Eric, but it's more to say, just be prepared for that, and take that into consideration.
Because be better than me, not a clone of me.
Yeah, be better than Eric. Yes. Is the point.
But and what's interesting is some stuff I do is even it's subconscious. Like, I did a lot of debates online, during the pandemic, and I started noticing people were pointing out that I'm smirking too much or something, and like taking that as me like giving a jab to the other person. Like I've been accused of a lot of things, but it was surprising to get accused of being, I guess, unkind or something because I smirked. And looking back, I can see that, because when they say something that I think is just so absurd, I just kind of.
Well, didn't Skylar Fiction point that out during your debate?
Right. Yes, that's right. I was.
And all you did was smile, right? And he's like, look at him.
Yeah, look at his face, and he's like that. And he's, oh my gosh! And he started. Right. Yeah, I highly recommend people to go watch that.
Well, he's not. Unfortunately, I honestly hope that nothing is wrong. But he's not on YouTube anymore, right? He's he deleted his channel or something.
Details are irrelevant, but there was some stuff in his life that he wanted to take a break from YouTube. I didn't talk to him personally. Someone sent me something that gave information on that. But on top of that,
so he was just. For people that may not know, Skylar Fiction was a sort of atheist YouTuber that existed in the very early stages of YouTube apologetics.
No longer exists.
No longer.
We can't explain his interaction.
Yeah.
So, and even just quickly on the other things, another thing that he would do is, I would notice that in previous talks, is when he would kind of get stuck in a corner, he would.
Which one are you talking about? David or okay?
Smalley. He would kind of say well, we've talked enough about this, let's move on, or we're not going to agree, let's move on. And I noticed he did that when he was kind of being pushed in a corner. So I think it was also with the evolutionary argument, to where he's like, well, we're just going to disagree, let's move on. And I said, well, before we move on, then, are you implicitly conceding what I just said there, because you didn't give me a response to that? So in other words, I think you want to move on because you don't want to go to the implications, but you haven't responded to this. So if we move on, I want to make the audience know that you're either conceding these or running from these. And that kind of, again, it kind of took that rhetoric away from him. And then even the other thing was, he would, sometimes his responses in that same situation would be like, well, I just disagree with you. I don't think that's true. And kind of move on from there as if that's somehow a rebuttal or something. He did something similar with me, and he's like, well, I just disagree with you. I'm like, well, of course you do. Otherwise, you wouldn't have me on your show. And given that we disagree, tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, and what I was also thinking of is that your approach to, you've got to take each debate sort of case by case and really study each person individually, because I'm sure that your approach in tomorrow's debate at CC Exchange 23 is not going to be anything like your approach in a debate with someone like David Smalley, right? Justin is I was just gonna say he's sweet. He is sweet. Like he's just a sweet guy. Sweet guy. But he's philosophically informed,
right?
Unlike someone like David Smalley.
Exactly.
So like when you mention an evolutionary argument against naturalism, and David wasn't even able to understand like the basics of the argument, you're not going to face that with someone like Justin Schieber. So it's important to sort of tailor your approach in each debate.
That's
well.
right. Yeah, and Justin sharp. So I don't. In other words, there would be nothing like what I did with Skylar or with Smalley, because Justin's not going there. So I don't need to match that kind of rhetoric.
Well, that's not his defense memechanism.
Right. Exactly.
His defense mechanism, Justin's, is going to be, well, let's look at the arguments, which is what you want. Like that's like if your goal is substance, then if you want truth to win, then it's good to find people that can fall back to the arguments. And I mean that's one of the reasons why I chose you to debate Justin, is because in these cases you still, like, even if people disagree about the things that you argue and that you defend, it really does come back to, like, you're always trying to push people back to the argument. And say, even in your debate with Matt Dillahunty, it's been a few years since I watched that one, but you were always trying to pull him back to discuss like the individual premises in the arguments and which ones do you reject and why.
And with someone like Justin, it's and I don't mind saying he's probably going to be one of the most challenging people I've ever debated, because he's not going for the rhetoric, he's going for the substance, which is again what you want. And I even see Justin in other debates concede points. We're like, oh yeah, well that's a good point, and I'm maybe he's like, I'm not entirely sure how to navigate that, and he's willing to admit that. In other words, he's not just trying to put up a show and like, I'm not going to concede anything. So so it's going to make for a good discussion. And we've even the audience might not know this, but we've even exchanged openings and rebuttals. I told someone that the other day. They're like, why would you do that? He knows what you're going to say. I'm like, well, if my arguments are true and they work, what does it matter if he knows them? I should be able to defend us on the substance of them, not on trying to pull a fast one or blindside him with something.
Well, one point on that. So William Lane Craig, he's been on Capturing Christianity several times at this point, but he was mentioning. I did a show with him and Jim Tour. Did you watch that show on abiogenesis? Good episode to watch. But after the show, so Jim Tour is actually debating Dave Farina. You know who Dave Farina is?
Sounds familiar.
Professor Dave.
Oh, yes.
Professor Dave.
Yeah.
So Professor Dave has been going after Jim Tour on the abiogenesis stuff, which I don't know that I even pronounced that word correctly. Yeah. But anyways, they're having a debate. It's on like May 22nd or something like that in Houston. Oh. So you should come down we could go. I actually got him to get me tickets. So. Oh, nice. Or like save me seats or something. So it's at Rice.
Okay.
Rice in Houston. Sweet. So yeah, if you're interested in coming down for it, it'd be fun to go watch it.
Yeah, I'll 22nd.
What's funny is that I actually I've had some interactions with Professor Dave on Twitter today. I don't know if you saw. I posted something on Facebook about it. Yeah. So this is a huge tangent. So on yesterday, I posted. All you have to say is
suffice it to say, and then say whatever you want.
Suffice to say, yesterday I posted I've been posting these different arguments. We did a stream a long time ago, 150 something arguments for the existence of God, which were individual arguments taken from like professional papers defended by philosophers and everything. So we did this whole video on it. Anyway, so I've been making these graphics, one argument per day that I'll post on our social media.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And so one of the arguments is like a parody.
I saw that.
It's a parody, yeah, right. So it's not an actual argument that any theist has defended. The first premise says everything has a cause. And some atheists will think that theists have argued that or are arguing that premise when no theist, like philosophically minded theist, has ever defended such a ridiculous premise like that. So anyways, the argument is obviously a straw man, if you're familiar at all with philosophy of religion. So I posted that on Twitter, and then Professor Dave, responds by saying, well, premise 1 is ridiculous, and premise 3 is like, so he didn't read, like in the post, I made it clear that this is not a real argument. Right. It's fake, and it's like the purpose of it is to show that no theist defends it. And then he treated it as if like, so he didn't read the post. And so I pointed that out, and he was like, oh yeah, I should have read it more carefully. And then he asked me for a better argument for God's existence. So then I sent him a recent video that I did with Dustin Crummett on his argument from Psychophysical Harmony. Yeah. And so it's only an hour long, and it's like a summary of the argument. And it's like the latest, cutting edge, newest argument for the existence of God. Some apologists have called it like the greatest argument ever developed for the existence of God. So I was like, this is a good one. Like, go check this one out. And then he responded, oh, I'm not watching that. Like, I'm not wasting an hour of my time just to confirm that there's no arguments, good arguments for the existence of God.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, so you wanted an argument, and I gave you one, and you don't want to. Interesting. Anyways, going back to where we left off, Jim Tour. So he's got this debate coming up, and so after the show with Dr. Craig and Jim Tour a couple weeks ago at this point, Dr. Craig was giving him some tips on how to debate.
Oh, very good.
Right, and so one of the things that he was mentioning was that you always want to go first. That's because it gives you a foot up. Is that the right expression?
Sure.
It gives you
leg up.
A leg up. It gives you a leg up. Yeah, I'm terrible with expressions. Right. So what it does is that you give your opening first. And usually what happens in a debate is that your debate opponent doesn't know your opening. Right. And so they give their opening, you give your rebuttal, and then what do they have to do in their first rebuttal? They have to respond to your opening and what you said in your response to their opening. Mm-hmm. So they have a big job in their first rebuttal. And that is why Dr. Craig and any sort of experienced debater recommends going first. Mm-hmm. But in a context like this, what we're having is that you've exchanged opening statements, so that's not going to be an issue. And you're also, I don't know if that you've exchanged first rebuttals. You have? Okay. So you completed those, and you've already submitted those to each other. So you know exactly what everyone's going to say. And so no one's being put in this debate, even though you're going first, there's no one's being like, there's no advantage in this case, which is actually pretty cool. And to me, it's like, again, the idea is that we want substance and truth to win. And in a debate structured in this way, I think it can happen.
And I'll say I wouldn't do that with just anybody or everybody.
Yeah.
From what I've known about Justin and our interaction, he's a respectful guy. He's a nice guy. He's not trying to get a gotcha. And I even had limited time too as well to study. So I'm like, well, there's no reason not to. It seems like I can trust him. You vouch for him very well. So it's like, well, if we exchange, sure, I lose the surprise, if you will, but I also now know exactly what to look at.
Right. Yeah. And also when we do switch to like the open dialogue in the middle, I think that the first two sections are really going to open it up to have some good dialogue on the key areas where the two of you are sort of going to disagree. So I think it's going to be just a phenomenal debate. I mean, I can mention one more time. This debate is happening. Today is May 5th, 2023. It is happening tomorrow in Houston. So if you happen to be watching this and you're in the Houston area, you haven't registered and you want to come see the debate, then come and see it. Now, the only thing is that we don't have since this is a free event, we have no idea how many people to expect to show up to this. We've asked people to go and register on our website, but there's just no telling. Like, we could have 80 people, we could have 150 people, we could have like 300 or 400 people show up to this debate. We don't know, because this is also being live streamed. So if you're not in the area and you still want to see it, then it's being live streamed for free on our channel as well. But it's going to be pretty good and exciting. I think this is going to be cool. Mm-hmm. Well, why don't we go ahead and sort of end it there? Is there anything that you'd like to sort of leave with the audience?
Keep me in your prayers for tomorrow. You can check out some of the debates we mentioned. You can go on my YouTube channel. Just type my name in, Eric Hernandez.
Do you post all of your debates on your channel?
Yeah. Or
most of them?
Yeah.
Are you working on? Are you like? Would you consider yourself a YouTuber?
Maybe not in.
Well, you don't make your living from YouTube,
right? Yeah,
from doing YouTube.
Not in that way. And really, I mean, I don't spend too much. I wish I could, but like my full time job is doing apologetics for Texas Baptists, traveling and speaking, doing conferences. So YouTube is more like something I do on the side if I have time. Like I haven't posted anything in maybe a month just because I've been preparing for this debate. But like you said, I don't make my living off of it, so it's not like I'm needing to push it out there and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, Eric, I'm super excited for tomorrow. This has been a lot of fun too.
Oh yeah,
I'm sure that we could have gone a lot of different directions as well. But yeah, we need to do more stuff, and it'd be cool to have you come down in a couple weeks for that debate. So that'd be cool.
Hopefully I can do that.
Yeah, thank you guys for tuning in. Let me know what you think in the comments. Again, I can't read the live chat, so hopefully it looks like our mics are still on and everything. Thank you guys for tuning in. I should have mentioned this earlier. We have some free resources in the description of every video. So if you're interested, this is completely 100% free. The Rationality of Christian Theism is a 60-page ebook that myself and Dustin Crummett co-authored. And then we also have this ultimate list of apologetics terms for beginners, hundreds of terms that get used in these apologetics discussions, like epistemology, ontology, dualism. All of these terms are defined for you, and there's also hyperlinks to important resources like encyclopedias and stuff. And these PDFs are available for free if you go to the description and click the link and enter in your email address and become one of our subscribers. So, oh yeah, and I don't mention this either, and this is like the worst time to mention this. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, share the video if you enjoyed it. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video. See you guys later. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that